So welcome to our monthly lunch sponsored by the Key Biscayne Community Foundation. Again, I will repeat it until the day I close my eyes. Their generosity is amazing. If you're ever looking to give back to something worthwhile, something that actually makes a difference locally, they are the organization that you should give to.
Thanks, Roxy. Thank you all for coming today. Again, for those of you who don't know, my name is Ramya. I'm the Director of Environmental Science for the Key Biscayne Community Foundation. And as Roxy said, we do these every month, usually the last Thursday of the month. And you know, as long as I'm here, we'll just keep bringing them and hopefully keep you guys entertained and educated. Today we have with us Dr. David Diez. He is an adjunct professor at the Rosenstiel School right next door. He also is branch director at NOAA for migratory species, which is why he's talking about migratory animals today. And very special to me, actually, because he was the chair of my committee when I did my first master's, and one of the most encouraging people that I have ever worked with. And I just want to say quickly, so he gave a talk for us about several years ago. It was when Ultra came to Virginia Key and everybody was, mad about it. He did a study for us looking at the piping plovers that hang out on the edge of Virginia Key right next to where Ultra was happening. And he was looking to see, if the sound from Ultra was affecting them in any way, if it was causing them to leave early or go, to a different location, anything like that. And the thing is, the timing of Ultra happened to coincide pretty closely with their normal migratory patterns. So they would have been leaving at that time anyway. And after, he went out there and studied them. Basically, the study showed that it was inconclusive as to whether they moved on because of the sound from Ultra or because it was just time for them to migrate. But the reason I bring that up is because of a specific point that he made, which is we don't do science to get the answers that we want. And I think that's a really, really important idea to keep in mind. We study science, we do science to learn. We just want to know how everything works and what's going on in the world. And it's really important for us to do that in order to exist in the world. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Dr. Diez.
Well, thank you, Rumia, and thanks to the Key Biscayne Community Foundation and the Key Biscayne Community Center for welcoming me here. I'm going to talk a little bit about birds and particularly piping plovers in the second half of my talk. But I think I want to stress how blessed we are, how privileged we are to live in the environment that we live in, both in Key Biscayne but also in our neighborhood of Virginia Key. So I'm going to talk to you all about some of the amazing nature things that we have around, including some of the animals that migrate and then visit these islands over certain seasons. Some of you may know that the Key Biscayne Community Foundation sponsors some citizen science projects. And one of these citizen science projects that they do sponsor relates to an application that allows you to identify all kinds of living things, plants, birds, any kind of animal. And this is called iNaturalist. You can have it on your phone, you take a picture, and you actually get the application in your phone to identify what kind of bird, what kind of plant this is. And the Key Biscayne Community Foundation has been supporting one of the projects that has been created in this app, which is called a Key Biscayne Project Key Challenge for understanding the kind of animals and birds and plants that we have in the Key. So you can sign in to this app, put it on your phone, and every time that you're interested in a plant or animal, and you take a photo, you'll be able to get it identified by the app, and then you can upload it to this project so we find out what kind of animals and plants do we have. And as you can see, there's over 1,000 species that already live in the Key that have been identified through this application. And I want to highlight this because there's probably many, many more species that are around the Key that we've never seen, that we've never been reported. So if any of you are interested in understanding a little bit more about how important biodiversity, how amazing biodiversity we have in this island, I'll urge you to try it. It's really easy to use and very effective at giving you information about the nature.
What's the website?
You go to an app and it's called iNaturalist. iNaturalist, a single word. So if you go to the app store in your phone, what type of phone, you will be able to download the app and register, and you'll be able to use it to identify anything you want that is a living thing. It's really amazing. So what are some of the animals that come through the seasons here in Key Biscayne, and that some of the animals that spend time either the entire year on the island or some part of the sometimes of the year? I'm sure many of you expect that I'll speak about birds, and there are some of these that are resident, like us. How many of you are residents in the Key? Most of you? Quite a few. Why did I stay here? Well, a part that is a great community because of the people that live in, because of the amazing nature that we have around us. So some of these species are actually species that spend the entire year here, like these that you see, including the owls. I don't know how many you know, but there are these burrowing owls are in the Key. Not in many places, and they live on, they make the nests underground, and they are quite hard to see in the Key. I've only seen them a couple of times, but they live here. In Crandon, I've seen them in Crandon Park. Mockingbirds, some of the ducks that you see. Ducks are often more seasonal. They come and go, and they spend here the winter. Like, I don't know how many of you are seasonal inhabitants to the Key. Some of you. Well, you probably know that many of the birds do the same thing as you do. There's also many ocean animals that migrate along the coast, along either the ocean side, and some of them actually come into the estuaries. You probably heard about sharks. People talk about sharks, love sharks, hate sharks, are afraid of sharks. The truth is that if you see a shark, you're super lucky. I swim most days on the ocean side of Key Biscayne, and the day that I see a shark, I actually do a big fist on the air because I feel I'm so privileged. Most of the ones that you're going to see are not like these, are not these species. You're mostly going to see nurse sharks. If you see them swimming just next to the, sometimes they're really small. It's rare to see anything else other than a nurse shark. There are some others that would swim around, but you most of the time won't see them unless somebody's fishing off the beach and they are attracting them with the bait. But these species are often migratory. They come around, spend here. Many of them spend the winter because it's too cold up north, and they migrate through our coastal areas. Some of them are resident in the ocean. We also have sea turtles. I'm sure that you all know about the fact that nesting beaches in Key Biscayne and Virginia Key are important nesting beaches for mostly loggerheads, but we also have some green sea turtles and occasionally some leatherbacks, which are the very, very large, and you're really lucky if you see a leatherback. I've never seen a leatherback in the Key. And you see them mostly during the summer. Yes?
I just wanted to say we had one leatherback nest in Bill Bags and one in Crandon last year. For the first time since 2017, I think.
Yeah, and normally, you get 50 or 60 nests in Bill Bags alone of the of the other species. So leatherbacks are quite rare. I'm not showing any of the pictures are here, leatherbacks, and you mostly see loggerheads. And they get monitored every year. People like Rumia and other volunteers do the counts of the nesting beaches in Key Biscayne as well as in Virginia Key, because these are protected species, as you know. We need to take care of them. They occupy the same beaches that we occupy, but we want to leave them enough room so that they continue to reproduce successfully, and their populations continue to increase. So how do we study all these animals that come around the island? We use a lot of different techniques. Some of you may have heard some of these, some may be quite new. We use acoustic tags. These are real small transmitters that we put in the body of the animal, either inside the body or outside the body. For fish, you put them inside in the abdominal cavity, in a place where it doesn't hurt the animal, and you actually have to do a little bit of surgery. So you do an incision, you introduce the transmitter, and then you sew the skin and the muscle so that it doesn't get infected, and you put some antibiotic. You release the fish, or in, a sea turtle will typically carry it on the carapace. You release the animal, and these little transmitters will emit a signal periodically. Every few seconds they emit a signal that has a number on it, and if it goes by a receiver that is in the environment, the receiver will record the presence of that animal and an identifying number, and we will tell you which specific animal was the one that went by that receiver. So there are networks of receivers all over the ocean that have been put by many different types of researchers and projects, and they've now gotten together to put all the data from the different receivers into a single network of observations. Data visualization tool, we get an idea of the areas that are being monitored through these receivers. These are, as I said, receivers that are put in different places and that allow you to detect animals that are within a given radius. Typically it's about 500 meters around, it will detect it. Sometimes it's less than that. So the areas in blue represent the areas that are covered by current receivers. And in this case, this is for, I believe, is for blacktip sharks. The red dots represent the places where they've detected them, that they came next to a receiver, and therefore that their presence was detected. And if you can see, we have actually a dot. I don't know if this thing works. We have a dot very close to Key Biscayne. So, blacktip sharks do come around and visit us at some points of the, most likely in the winter. So this is another way we know where animals go when they migrate, when they move out of this area. We have these networks of receivers. We know some animals, these receivers have a limited battery, so they will last certain time, and then the battery runs out and you don't see the animal anymore, but they typically they can last over years. Yes? Yes, for many of the species we've seen declines in population. For others we've seen increases. So the sea turtles lately are doing rather well. At least the loggerheads, they've been recovering largely by the management measures that have been imposed to help them recover, like the prohibition of lights on beaches that during the nesting period helps the survival of the young as well as the return of the adults. Through the imposition of turtle excluder devices in the shrimp trawling fisheries, and various other protection measures, including the prohibition of interacting with a wild sea turtle. If you are just in the public, you're not supposed to approach them or distress them through your approach. For other species, like many of the sharks, they continue to decline. We haven't been able to manage some of their impacts that we do on those populations effectively enough that we would stop the decline. Another way we do is we track these animals is through putting them what we call satellite tags. These are, again, little devices that we put on the animal that will transmit the position of the animal as well as some additional information that the sensors in the tag provide, such as the depth, the temperature at which the animal is swimming. In some cases, we have accelerometers that allow us to tell how fast and what direction they are moving through the water when they are swimming. So this, we've done extensive work on this at the University of Miami, primarily with sharks and other fish. And you often put the tags externally to the animal. So they are hanging on their dorsal part, and as the animal swims, it will be recording the position, the temperature, the depth. Now, when the animal is primarily an animal that doesn't surface, it cannot transmit. It can only transmit when the antenna, you see that little antenna on the fish, the right, your right, when it surfaces, it connects to a satellite, and then it sends data to that satellite. But if the animal doesn't surface, like many of the fish that we use these tags with, then the only way we can get that information is if the tag is released, pops up to the surface, and then sends the information. Yes?
So just to be clear, it's continuously collecting data, but that data doesn't get transmitted until it comes to the surface. So then you get all the data from previously that it has been collecting this whole time.
That's correct. Thanks, Runa. So what we do is for those animals that don't typically surface, then we put a release mechanism on the tag that after a certain number of months or days, depending on what kind of study you do, you allow the tag to float. And as soon as it floats and the antenna gets in contact with the air, it detects that it can transmit.
Studying these animals, I mean, I'm worried about maybe they feel some pain when you do the surgery and inflict. So what's the ultimate?
Very good question. Why? Well, why? Because most people, these crazy scientists, why do they torture these poor animals? Well, we're looking for the kind of answers that I was asked before. Are these populations healthy? Are we making them decline through our interactions, through our various activities in the ocean? Is there something that we should do to help them recover and continue to increase in their populations if their populations have declined? So it's primarily to understand how we can manage our actions to make sure that all these wonderful animals continue to be there and thrive. That's the main purpose. So it's not exclusively academic research that is just fascinates some people, crazy scientists like me. It's primarily to help us manage the resources. And the reason why this research on migrating animals is so important and requires this technology and requires that we certainly harm partially some of these animals is that it is very difficult to understand their populations if you don't understand where they are at different points in time. So if you don't understand their migration, it is really hard to figure out their populations. It's if the same question, if I didn't understand that some people come from New York and New Jersey to spend the winter, it would be very hard to understand what's the real population of Key Biscayne. Yes, Rumi.
I just want to say some of these tags also, like it looks big and bulky, but the part that's actually holding onto the fish is quite small. And a lot of, depending on the tag, obviously that one that went in the fish was fairly large compared to the fish. But a lot of them are almost close to or equivalent to what you are doing if you put a microchip in your dog. So it's like it hurts and it makes a hole and it bleeds a bit, but it's not something that's going to harm them in the long run and they'll heal from it.
But that's a very good question. And I can tell you through my years of research, I've seen our job change dramatically in that aspect. From the time that I started my study in marine science, we were never asked from the public about whether we were harming the animals that we had in research. Now we have to prepare plans for making sure we take that into account, that we minimize any harm that we do to animals, that we minimize the number of animals that we work with, so that we don't do a bigger harm in studying them that we are trying to do by helping them. Yes, you have another question?
Actually like a surgery, right?
It is.
Inserting a foreign object and then
Yes, it is.
stitches.
It is surgery. It is surgery. So yes, you have to treat them with antibiotics to make sure that they're not going to get infected. We've been doing a lot of research on reducing the size of the tags so they are less damaging to the animal, and basically optimizing the surgery procedure so that the animals don't get affected by all this process. Yes? How do you catch them? Depends on the animal. Fish, you typically catch them with a hook. So you hook them. You know, sometimes we can trap them, but most often on fish you hook them. You do them with typically just regular hand line, pollen line, and you try to minimize the fighting time so that they are not hurt by that. You also have processes to help them recover before you release them. So for the sharks, which you know, most of the sharks need to continuously be swimming in order to be able to breathe, because they're not like bony fishes that have an operculum that can pump water through their gills. Sharks have to open their mouth as the water flows into their bodies. That's how they breathe. So when you catch a shark and you stop them from swimming, it's basically running out of air. Well, running out of oxygen because there's no water flow. So after you catch a shark and you're going to release it, you should hold it, or any other fish, you should hold it for a while, making sure that it's recovered before you release it. Otherwise, it probably is going to be very stressed and therefore be affected by the handling.
If you insert a transmitter in a smaller fish and the shark eats it, is the transmitter now in the...
Yeah, I haven't even problem to ask me that question, but that's a fascinating thing. In fact, those kind of things are the ones that we use to understand when a shark or when a tag animal dies. Why is that? Because part of the information that we get is the habitat that they are using while they're swimming. We know the depth, we have information on the depth, the temperature, and we can then understand what kind of diving, let's say, one of these animals. We tag, for instance, billfish, like marlin, sailfish, tuna. We understand that they may be diving to 100 meters, 200 meters, or a shark normally. And then suddenly you see a trace where an animal that was the maximum depth he was diving was 100, 200 meters, and he goes to 500. And suddenly he starts switching and migrating to 500. We often identify that this animal has been eaten by another animal that has a different type of diving pattern, and we then can use that as evidence of predation, which is really, really hard to observe in the marine environment. You know, when somebody eats another animal, unless you are there, which is really hard, it's very difficult. So those are often very useful sets of data. Many of you know what this picture is all about. What's this picture? So it's Virginia Key as we cross Bearcat and leave our lovely island, right? And what is that? That's the Rosenstiel. That's my school. That's Lynn's school. That's Urumia School, the University of Miami. How about these other two buildings? How many of you? No. Oh, wow. I have an impressive audience here, I must say. When I speak to many of my neighbors, they have no clue what those buildings are. I tell them, NOAA. What's NOAA? Well, one of the buildings is the NOAA Atlantic Oceanographic and Meteorological Laboratory, and the other one is the Southeast Fisheries Science Center. So they're both NOAA labs, and they do very important work, including a lot of the work that I'm speaking about is supported by a lot of the research that is done in those two labs. AOML, which is the lab, the second lab as you cross the bridge, does work on meteorology, climate, oceanography, but also on protected resources like corals and the impacts of human as well as climate and weather events. And it does work on hurricanes, as you probably know. So there's a lot of work done on hurricane forecasts, on hurricane predictions. Some of the scientists that go on the NOAA planes that go inside the hurricane are in that lab. So you've probably seen some of them on the TV. And the other lab is the fisheries lab, which is the one that right before, as you pass the bridge on your right, which does work for the regional fishery management councils, the Gulf Council, the South Atlantic, and the Caribbean Council. All the work that is done to manage those fishery resources and those protected species are led by the lab in Virginia Key. So if you didn't know that, they are the ones that are supporting all the regulations that help manage the fishery resources, that help conserving the sea turtles, the dolphins, and all these other resources. They work on reef fish, they work on pelagics. These are, by the way, these are small sailfish. These are about this big that are caught in the Sargasso Sea, where they spend most of their early life underneath the Sargasso mats. On the left bottom is a SCAD, one of the groupers, and they do a lot of work on marine mammals like the dolphins on the bay. You know that there's a population of dolphins, bottlenose dolphins. They monitor them periodically, and you can actually recognize each individual by the fin. By the shape of the fin, they are like a driver license for dolphins. But NOAA is a lot more than hurricanes and the two labs. There's other areas of NOAA, the National Weather Service, which you probably, I don't know how many of you, where do you get your information about weather? Many of you may get it from the Weather Channel, from various apps. Well, the majority of the data comes from NOAA. So NOAA produces the data that supports predictions of rain, temperature, but also the marine forecasts. Those of you that are boaters know that you actually depend on NOAA sets of buoys and observations and satellite observations. And any of you are pilots or no? Aviation. All the aviation forecasts also come from the National Weather Service. And unfortunately, because it is NOAA, the National Weather Service is also has lost about 10% of their workforce already, and potentially will have other losses. They are the ones that maintain all this array of weather stations throughout the nation. As you probably know, this is one of the weather stations. And I'm putting it there because not many of you would know that they're not just useful for weather. They're useful for birds and animals. Did any of you know about that? Okay, so I'll speak a little bit about that. One of the things that I've done through my last 20 years of research has been working on the large fish, on the tunas. And I've done that through with International Commission of Atlantic Tunas, which the US is a member of, which basically helps manage all these large fish resources in the Atlantic Ocean together between all the nations that fish them and that are dependent on them. So the US is one of the nations, but there's 50 or 60 of them that are members of the commission. And one of the big projects that we did was a tagging project where we tag 120,000 tuna over a period of 5 years of the three big species of tuna, the tropical tuna, the yellowfin, which is probably the one that if you eat tuna around here, it's probably going to be yellowfin. Big-eyed tuna, which is one that you may eat in the sushi restaurant if it's a really fancy sushi restaurant. Most of the sushi restaurants around here will be serving yellowfin. But if you go to a fancy one, they may serve you big-eye, which is a deeper species, also a tropical species. And skipjack, which is the one that you'll find mostly if you're eating canned tuna. And we tag 120,000 of these species, and we tag them through different ways, again, to be able to understand how we manage them effectively. What are the kind of quotas that we have to tell the fishermen, what kind of gear we should tell them they should be able to use, so that we still have tuna in the future and for future generations as well. So we use these conventional tags. These are the ones that you see on the top. These are just what we call spaghetti tags. They look like a spaghetti. They're just plastic. You insert them in the fish or whatever other species, and all they have is a number and a phone. So they don't transmit any information. They're there just in case a fisherman recovers a fish can report that fish where you caught it, and we can figure out where was it released, where was it recovered, and therefore how did it move, how did it migrate. So that's the traditional and most and older technology for marking animals. All they have is an identifier and potentially a phone number where you can report it. So that's the one on the top. It's a plastic, it's pretty inert. So all it has is a small T that goes into the muscle. And no, it does not affect. We've seen, no. But it's a really good question, because when we proposed to do this for bluefin tuna, which goes to the Japanese sushi market and is incredibly expensive, the Japanese objected because they were not convinced that it did not affect the quality of the meat. And it did not affect the price that it was going to get in the auction. But we did studies and we showed that it did not affect it. And in case of, a bluefin tuna is about can weigh 1,200 pounds, and this is something that is like a spaghetti. So it is highly unlikely that it'll affect it. But we also use the surgery and implant those tags that are going to record the temperature. This is one of the surgeries that we're doing on a yellowfin tuna. You see the sutures here, and this is the antenna that is actually measuring depth and temperature for this particular. These tags, you have to recover the fish since they cannot be released. So if the fish is recovered and you see that it has a mark, we would actually remove it. So it depends on the fisherman actually encountering that fish when it's recovered. And it records there all those temperature measurements. And we also use the satellite tags that pop out of the fish after a certain number of days. We don't just tag fish. One of the things that I think is also amazing is that, I don't know how many you know, but most of the tuna that is produced for canning comes for pursening. Pursening is that these very large vessels, some of them measure 300 feet, that set up a net and catch a whole school of tuna, mostly skipjack tuna. And those tuna are then taken to the cannery and make it to our cans that we use for tuna salad. But in order to maximize the chance of catching tuna, they've started using what we call fish aggregating devices. Those that fish around here would know that every time you see something floating in the ocean, there's a chance there's fish underneath it. They aggregate anything that floats in the ocean is structure that the animals get attracted to. You can see that in the picture up there. That's an oceanographic buoy that actually has fish aggregating underneath it. So fishermen now for decades have been releasing fish aggregating devices. These are things that they let go in the ocean. They go with the currents. They have a subsurface structure that aggregates the fish, whether it's ropes, whether it's pieces of old net. And the tuna, particularly, the schools of tuna aggregate around them. And that makes it a lot easier for the fishermen to catch and locate those tuna. Partially because nowadays they have these buoys that not only do they tell the fishermen where that fish aggregating device it is, because it sends the information and location to the satellite, but it also has an acoustic sensor, like a fish finder, that tells them exactly how much fish there is underneath that aggregating device. So the vessel now has a set of, maybe 100 of these floating around the ocean and figures out, oh, that one over there has fish, I'm going to go. And like that, rather than running around or sailing around the ocean looking for schools of tuna, they know for sure where they can catch them because they have the information. They release these primarily in the coast of Africa. The map on the right, those blue spaghettis are the tracks of these devices from one of the fleets that were provided to us. So they release them in West Africa, and as they move west with the currents, they grab them back and they release them back in the coast, because once you get very, very far from the West African coast, there's fewer and fewer tuna. So it makes sense to bring them back. Some of them are never caught, are never retrieved. So they keep going with the currents. And this is one of them here. This is the float, and this is the buoy. Where do you think I found this? In the lighthouse, in Bilbags. I found it in November last year. Went for a run, and I work on these things for decades. What did I see on the beach? A fad that came probably from Senegal. So there's also migrating fish deer that are coming to Key Biscayne beaches because it's such a nice place. So I've spoken about enough about all the other things. I'm going to speak now about birds. And these are some of the species you'd see on the beach in Crandon Park and Bilbags. These are the shorebirds, which I've studied now for a good part of 6 years. Some of you may recognize them. And I'm going to focus on the one on the center, the piping plover. And the reason for that is primarily that when I was teaching, I wanted to be able to talk about tagging animals to my students and showing them actually marine animals with marks that we had released. But it was really hard to do that in the marine environment. It's really hard to find a tuna, if you know, even though we tag 120,000, really hard to get every Tuesday that I have a class, take them and see them and get them to see one of these tag animals in the wild. But piping plovers are actually one of the species that gets banded up north, and I'll speak about why, and that therefore provided me the opportunity to show and take my class to the beach in Crandon to see these birds. So how do we study these birds? Well, one of the biggest and most important tools that we use for bird studies nowadays is eBird. Any of you are familiar with eBird? This is a citizen scientist app, another one like iNaturalist, but this is specifically for birds. So it was originally for bird watchers. Nowadays is one of the biggest sources of information for ornithologists that tells us. These are observations from citizen scientists, from people like you that like birds and that report those birds through the app to the Cornell laboratory. Ornithology laboratory, which has developed this app to be an incredible app. Then so this app allows you to basically report birds as you see them in your backyard or as you visit the park, and it allows us, the researchers, to find out where birds are at different times in the US, but around the world. This app is used around the world. They also have develop BirdVox. This is another technique that is being used also by citizen scientists as well as by scientists, which allows you to identify birds by their songs or their calls. So if you record a bird in your backyard and you use one of these apps, including the eBird, you'll be able to identify it from the call, from the singing by the app. And again, this BirdVox will be ultimately used to set up a set of listening stations around the world that you can have. If you are interested, there are commercial products now that you can put in your backyard and that will continuously be recording bird songs and identify what birds are in your backyard. But one of the most incredible things that has been, yes?
On my phone, it's a Cornell Lab app. It's called Merlin, and it does the same thing as BirdVox, which is basically you can record any bird that you hear singing, and it will try to identify it for you.
Yeah, Merlin is also from the Cornell Lab. So with this information, with a lot of this information that comes from the citizen scientist, one of the things that they've been able to do is produce, together with the information that I was telling you about, the weather stations, they're able to now predict migration of birds. So the citizen scientists tell us exactly what species of birds is where and when, and the weather stations are used at night to identify birds. So birds, when they fly over a weather station, they send a signal that can be identified from the weather station as being birds flying. It cannot identify what kind of bird it is, but it can identify whether it is a bird, or in some cases we can identify insects. Some of the massive migration of insects can also be detected by these radars. So these are special weather radars that are set primarily to do rain forecasts, but as I said, now they can, they don't only identify the rain particles, but they can actually identify the birds that are flying. So this tool called Birdcast will tell you daily what's the prediction for how many birds are flying through the US. And you can actually look at predictions in our county. They will tell you how many are flying through the time in your county. So if you want, in times of migration, which is the fall and spring, this is very, very useful. It will tell you are birds going to show up in your neighborhood or not. In addition to telling you how many have flown, it actually produces forecasts. So it tells us how many they think you're going to get tonight. Before the night has arrived, it's making predictions. So the same way that we get weather predictions, now we get bird migrating predictions. And it's thanks to the combination of the weather radars as well as the observation from citizen scientists. The citizen scientists tell us what species are migrating. The weather tells us how abundant are the flying birds that are migrating, primarily overnight, when most of the migration of birds happens overnight. And they don't like flying during the day because the predation pressure is much higher. They can be actually eaten by some of the other birds that are migrating. So they mostly fly at night, and then they rest during the day, and they continue their journey on the following night. These are the kind of predictions that you see. This is for Miami-Dade County. This should be today, yes, March 26th. It tells you what happened last night. This is what you see over there. You see that how many birds were in flight over Miami-Dade County, and the species that you have most likely migrating through our county. And on these graphs, they tell you the current year. The green trace is the current year pattern of migrating birds, and the gray is the average. So you see we're starting to get to the period of April, May, where the majority of the spring migration is happening, of birds flying from the south towards the north to spend the summer in the northern latitude. With warming, what tends to happen is that birds get here earlier because it's warming sooner, and both in the fall migration and in the spring migration. That's one of the major things that we see. How many of you know that we have a banding station in the Cape Florida? So in the state park, for the last 25 years, pretty much, we have a banding station where, supported primarily from Audubon, Florida, that they've been banding birds. We catch the birds on what we call mist nets. So you put nets that the bird cannot see. We put them before dawn, and between dawn and noon, we monitor those nets every 20 minutes, and every time a bird gets caught in them, we identify the bird, we measure the bird, and we put a little band on their legs, on their feet, and we release them. And we've been studying that for the last 20 odd years, every year, and many of the species that you see, sometimes in your gardens, we observe them in that.
I just wanted to say, I believe it is the second oldest banding station in the country.
Continuous banding station in the US. And this is a very, Key Biscayne, and in particular Lighthouse, is a very special place because many of the birds, that's the last land place they see before they move to the Caribbean or South America. And if they're coming in, often is the first place they land. So they need food both for the migrating journey south or the migrating, or to recover from the crossing the ocean when they're coming in during the spring, during the fall, sorry. So these are some of the pretty ones that we see. Many of them are warblers because since we put them on the forest, the majority of the birds that we catch are small birds. We sometimes catch a raptor like a hawk, but mostly are, and we catch about and band a few thousand every year during a period of several weeks during the spring and fall migration. Yes, we do have volunteers for that. We do have volunteers, so yeah.
Can they tell, like, when a hurricane is coming and so enough time for them to migrate, or an earthquake even happens, or earthquakes, and I hear birds?
Yeah, I think certainly storms affect them clearly, and we often see them land in the Cape Florida right after a storm or right during the storm before the storm hits. They know, they can sense the weather, obviously, as they are flying, and it affects their pattern of migration. The wind pattern, if the wind is coming from the east or coming from the west, if the wind is coming from the east, it tends to push them towards our coast. If the wind is coming from the west, sometimes it pushes them offshore. So it really is affect. Whether they can sense earthquake, where I'm probably pretty sure that here they won't because there's no earthquakes for the most part, but they certainly have sensory abilities that we don't have. So the last ones that I'm going to talk about are these shorebirds. For sure, the bands that we put on birds look a little bit like these. They are typically the ones that are here. You hardly see it, that it's just a gray aluminum. That's the band that is being used on bird banding for generations. But for shorebirds, they also put these combination color bands or these little flags, and that allows you to identify each individual just with the binoculars. So we know it's like the fish that you put a number. Here we know which individual by either the combination of colors or by the flag that they have. And piping plovers are interesting because there's so few of them. This is a species that is exclusive from North America. Some of them get to the Bahamas, like us, sometimes visit the Bahamas. But most of them, as you see in the map, stay within the US. Some go to Mexico and Cuba. The blue lines are the areas where they spend the winter, which is when we have them here. And the orange is where they nest during the spring. Yes?
How do the hurricane affect?
The hurricanes affect them not only here, but also up there. I have a story of one of them, of the plovers that we saw here, that was nesting up north in the Great Lakes, and one of the hurricanes that was here became extra tropical, hit the Great Lakes, and that pair of plovers abandoned their nest. So the biologists there recovered the eggs, brought them to the university, and hatched them in the lab to make sure that they were able to survive. And then they released those little ones, hope that they survive. Well, it turned out that both the mother that abandoned the nest showed up in Key Biscayne, and one of the little chicks that had never seen the mother because it was taken as an egg also showed up in Key Biscayne. How about that? They did not migrate together because they showed up about a month and a half apart. Who said that it was a winter visitor here? Who said that it was not a resident that came here only for the winter? Some of you. Why do New Yorkers spend their winters here? Okay. So why do New Yorkers come back to New York and New Jersey over the summer? Why? Because the summer here is tough. Well, it's tough for the birds as well. There's not a lot of food over the summer here. There's a lot more food up north. Up north, there's plenty of food over the summer. You know, the spring comes, all the insects are around all the coastal areas, the water warms, and there's plenty of worms and little crustaceans. So there's a lot more food. And the hawks and predators have not yet arrived. So it's plainly success, reproductive success, and survival. That's why these birds move up north and nest there, at least many of the species. Yes?
I'm a New Yorker,
Go ahead.
and I saw some blackbirds that remind me of grackles.
Yeah?
Are they ready to go? They have iridescent blue. they're
It could
black,
be grackles. I don't know.
And are they on their way
I'll,
back
I'll,
north?
I'll ask eBird about that, about whether the grackles are there. But it's possible.
Because they look empty in my backyard.
And they scream like grackles. They look like a grackle. It's probably a grackle.
But they're on their way north.
Yeah. A lot of the tropical birds are their way north. Yes, absolutely. The vultures are really, really important. They eat a lot of the dead stuff. They are, as you know, they feed on dead animals, and they also spend the winter here primarily, and then go all over the U.S. during the summer. So they move around a lot.
The Sargasso Sea.
So yeah, I hadn't spoken about Sargasso, and I could speak another lecture about Sargasso. But the Sargasso is one of the other things that moves around the ocean that we saw over the last few decades, that there was a huge increase in Sargasso in the equatorial area, which never had been observed previously. It started in the early 2000s, and as that area of Sargasso increased, we saw more and more coming to our beaches. So part of the reason why we saw a lot of Sargasso over recent years was that the population of Sargasso exploded in the equatorial area and got entrained by the currents, like that fish aggregating device that I showed you. It just came the same way through the currents. Now, that doesn't mean that before we didn't get Sargasso. Sargasso has been always there, primarily coming through the Gulf of Mexico, because the Sargasso that we get here rarely would come from the Sargasso Sea. The Sargasso Sea is down current from us. It would have to go all the way to Africa, around the equatorial edge of the Caribbean to come here if it was coming from the Sargasso Sea. And one of the reasons we think that we had all these large increases of sargassum was related to the mass of sargassum that set that increase in the equatorial area, which, by the way, over the last year and a half has not been there. Something's happened, it's not there. Yeah?
Why some birds migrate and some others not?
I stay in the Key all year for the same reasons. You know, if some of the birds migrate north, it leaves enough food for those that stay around. So it is exactly the same. Some birds have adapted to increase their chances of survival by moving north. Some others have adapted to specialize, to hang around. A mockingbird is resident all year. Why? It is also eats insects like most of these warblers, or like the catbird that migrates. Why doesn't the mockingbird? Well, the mockingbird is pretty aggressive. It sings like crazy, can imitate other birds. It has adapted to be able to survive in the difficult environment of the summer in Southeast Florida. And others have adapted to do something else. Yes?
We hear so much about avian flu. Has that affected South Florida?
I cannot comment too much on avian flu. I know that it affects both domesticated birds as well as wild birds. But I don't know exactly what portion of the wild birds have been affected. I know that it does affect them.
You mentioned that there's a study of different birds in terms of the years. Has there been a decrease in the population of the birds over the years?
Yeah, some species have clearly declined. Some of the warblers some species of warblers have clearly declined even over the period that we've seen them. And they could decline for many reasons. One of the potential reasons of decline is that they don't come so far south anymore. They stay in Georgia, in the Carolinas, or in northern Florida because it's warm enough there through the winter. So that's one of the potential and one of the difficult things to do. The ones that are easier to detect is the ones that are still using primarily Florida as a stopover and that keep going to the Caribbean. Those are easier to detect their declines. But there's clearly declines in many of the species of birds North America wide. That's been widely reported. Bird flu, I answered before. I know that it affects wild birds, but I don't know to what extent. So
Discuss or give your ideas on how pollution is affecting those populations in the ocean and the Sargasso Sea and on when folks in from the ocean?
So pollution, clearly it's an impact on any kind of wild animal, will impact it by pollution. I think in the coastal zone, there's plenty of evidence of, even in Biscayne Bay, we heard about the times that the beaches are closed because of spills in our processing plants. I think that the most important source of pollution that worries us today is plastics, particularly microplastics. When a plastic degenerates and turns into its original shape, as you probably know, plastic is made from these little balls that are produced by the petrochemical industry. And so they eventually, plastic, although in the environment it lasts for a long time, it eventually breaks into little pieces. And those little pieces, unfortunately, are everywhere. And they are in our food, they are in the environment, and they are obviously being ingested by animals. And we know that they can cause, particularly in some species, they can cause major impacts. Primarily in those species that are some of the seabirds that feed on the surface and that mistake pieces of plastic thinking that they are food. The reason piping plovers are interesting is that, as I mentioned, there's still very few. There's only a few thousand pairs. This is the number of pairs in the different populations. Some on the Great Plains, in the Great Lakes, and the eastern seaboard. And it's interesting because all of them, from all these different populations, come to Key Biscayne to spend the winter. So we get visitors from the plains, we have visitors from Canada, we have visitors from the Great Lakes, from New York and New Jersey. They spend their time in the Key. They spend the majority of their life in the Key, those that migrate south. Some of them keep flying and end up in the Caribbean, in the Bahamas. But the Key is a particularly interesting place for them, in fact. So this is one of them nesting in the beaches up north, just creating the nest before it puts. And you can see it actually has bands. It's just making the nest. It also puts those little rocks and shells around it to decorate it. Isn't that cute? So it decorates the nest. And it's both the female and the male that build the nest and take care of the yeah. Can you stop it and show the next one? Up north is where most of these birds get banded. Because when they are banded, they actually are much easier to catch. We catch both the adults as well as the little chicks, and they put the bands there and release them. And then they migrate south during the spring, the late spring, and show up here in the summer, and do not leave until March or April. So they're starting to leave the Key now, and by the beginning of May, this is when they are releasing. If you can show that one, that's when they are releasing the little chicks that are going to fly. And these are some of the ones that were removed from the nest because the nest had been abandoned or the nest was going to be flooded, and they were grown on the lab before they were released. So we've got three groups of plovers, of piping plovers. There are summer arrivals that come here in August and March. We have some October to March arrivals that typically are the young of the year. They get here after their parents have gotten here. And finally, we have some transients, these visitors. They just stop for a few days and they keep flying south. And this is the numbers that I've followed in a typical year in Key Biscayne and Crandon. About 50 of them are in the flock of shorebirds at the maximum. Some of them are fall arrivers, some are summer arrivers, and some are transient birds. The migration of these animals is really a challenging period. And most of the mortality happens in the first year of migrations, either the migration south or the migration north. That's where most of them end up dying because, they are only a few weeks old and they fly from the Great Lakes to here in less than 2 weeks. So you can imagine how challenging that is for a little bird. So even if they flew together, not many make it. I think there's about only 60% survival, so 1 of every 3 in the first migration doesn't make it. They get eaten, or they just starve to death, or they end up in a place they shouldn't be flying to.
So how about the peacocks? Are they native?
No, the peacocks are introduced. No. Is that a problem? They're beautiful. They're absolutely beautiful. They don't really compete with the natives, to my knowledge, especially because they eat a lot of the food that is given to them by people. So they don't compete with the natives that I know of. So I think they are pretty happy in Crandon. They reproduce pretty effectively. So they're going to stick around, yeah. Peacocks, Egyptian geese, Muscovy ducks. There's a couple of cranes, sandhill cranes that are resident. Those really depend on the food that is provided to them. I think they were provided to them originally by the park staff, and some corn they were leaving for them. Certainly the peacocks depend totally on them, and some of the ducks. They don't do much for the other species that come around. So the native species don't care about that type of food. I hardly see them eating on that, except for the ibises. And I don't think the ibises need any help. They have plenty of food that they find on different places. You know that all those green parrots come from the old parrot jungle. When Miami got hit by the hurricane and destroyed parrot jungle, all the parrots just left. And I know that some of the species of parakeets establish themselves quite happily in all over South Florida, or the larger parrots that are in Coral Gables. I see them sometimes at the university.
I've never seen a big one here.
No, I've never seen the big ones here. I only see the parakeets.
How about the crocs in the old zoo? Do they move around, migrate?
Yeah, the crocs in the old zoo are there. There's a couple of them. I see them. If I'm lucky, I see them. And they do move around. They sometimes go to the beach, take a swim, and they go to the golf course to eat some golf balls. I can't believe they've never been hit by a car, because they must go across Crandon at some point. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Support the citizen scientists, and those of you that are interested in citizen science, I urge you to look at some of these apps, because believe it or not, we really rely on the information that you provide for some of the work that we do. And thanks again to Rumia and to Key Biscayne Foundation and the Key Biscayne Community Center for welcoming me.
Thank you very much.